I don't even understand why you would measure anything in your practice. Does it even matter?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Perfect RIA podcast. I am your co-host, Matthew Jarvis, and with me, as usual, the man, the myth, the legend, Micah Shalansky. Micah, how are you, my friend?
Oh, Jarvis, I'm doing absolutely fantastic. Excited to jump into it today, right? We got a lot of things happening, got Surge going on, a lot of exciting things that are coming up. And one of the things that I really noticed kind of during this time is that, you know what, sometimes it's easy to take our eye off the ball and not really focus on things that we need to be focused on.
Yeah, it really is, right? Here we are, beginning of October. Surge is really ripping and rolling along. We've got 20, 30, 40 meetings a week, depending on your personal Surge schedule. And sometimes it's easy to just say, hey, you know what? Let me get through Surge. Let me get through the holidays. Suddenly the year is over, but we still have roughly 1/4 of the year ahead of us, right? From the day this podcast is aired, we have roughly 1/4 of the year. This is not the time to let off the gas. If anything, Micah, this is the time to say, let me really look at this year. Let me make one last push to make this year, 2023, my best year ever, and then let me set the stage for 2024.
You know, Jarvis, and I think I'm glad you said that last bit because it goes further than just wrapping up this year, right? So much of what we do, there's momentum behind it, right? Now, that means when we let our foot off the gas, we don't see that right away. So you let your foot off the gas right now, you just start wrapping stuff up. You don't really notice. You probably won't even notice it that much for this year. Yeah, it could have been a little more, but it probably won't. You're really going to feel that impact in 2024 this next year. And that's why it's so important to do business planning early. That's why with our Invictus members, we did business planning in September, which is like crazy early, but it's like, hey, let's finish out this year on track. Let's have our game plan for setting up 2024 so we can really be successful and really knock this thing out of the park. And Q4 is important for that.
Yeah, and Mike, a week after next on the 18th, we're going to do an entire webinar for all of our podcast listeners. So thank you for being a listener. We're going to do a podcast or a webinar for all of our listeners. The first part about all business planning, and Mike, I'm embarrassed to confess how many years I didn't do this, but the first part is knowing where you're at today. And you and I have run into this again and again. With our coaching of advisors, we look at a lot of tax returns. We look at a lot of profit and loss statements. And we'll ask an advisor first, right, before we look at their numbers. We'll say, hey, you know, where you're at for revenue for this year? Where are you at for number of days worked for value adds? And they'll tell us the numbers. And Micah, I believe that the numbers they tell us, because I did the same thing, are in their heart of hearts a sincere number. They are not malicious. Yes. They are not intentionally wrong. And then so they tell us one set of numbers, which, by the way, are the same numbers that end up in these surveys, and then we pull their P&L, and we say, wait a second, these numbers are dramatically different. Or we pull their ADV. You say, hey, you told me you had 200 million in assets. Your ADV says 110 million. What's going on here? Again, not malicious, but it's easy to kid ourselves about where we're at.
You know, I think that's really true. So, Jarvis, let's an example of that, right? Let's walk through this real quick because it's really quick for advisors for me to say, oh, well, I don't beef my numbers. I know what my numbers are. Here's a really quick example of that. You have 75 million under management, maybe 100 million under management, and you're like, hey, I charge my average fee is 1%. Yeah. So therefore, I'm making $1 million a year. And boom, that's where it's at, right? I charge 1%. I'm at $100 million in assets, and you're at I'm a $1 million a year producer. And we pull your P&L, and it's 497. And it's very true story, right? And you're like, whoa, I'm at 1%. And like, no, that's not how that works, right? Either you don't know how much AUM you have, or you don't know what your billing rate is. It's one of the two. And this really flies in the face of so many people because it's so inconceivable that we don't know these numbers, Jarvis. We latch onto them with some death grip, but it's the wrong numbers. We're not looking at the right ones. That's like a client coming in, let's put this in comparison, and saying, hey, I got $1 million and I'm ready to retire and I spend $5,000 a month. You're like, well, $1 million, $5,000 a month. I don't really care what their Social Security is. They're probably set, right? This is probably some solid numbers. And then you look at it and they have $600,000 in assets and they spend $12,000 a month. Ooh, okay, not the same, right? All these numbers are completely different. And you would be blown away as an advisor sitting with a client. Like, how do you not know that? It's the same thing in your own practice if you don't really look at the numbers. Not what you think the numbers should tell you, but what the real numbers are.
Yeah, and I think part of what we fall into there, Mike, and I know I'm guilty of this as well, is, you know, we kind of have an idea of the number, and then we round it up once, we round it up again, we round it up a third time, and what went from 30 days off suddenly becomes 130 days off, right? And I know we talked about this in the podcast, I think it was last year. I keep a calendar where I X off the dates that I take off, and so I have a running tally how many days I've taken off. That's a priority to me. But if I don't count those, that number gets off wildly. Same for value adds, where you and I do a value add every single quarter as a forcing mechanism, right? We'll talk to advisors. We'll say, hey, what was the last value add? Oh, we just did one the other day. Well, what day was it? And we pull it up. Where this comes up for me, Micah, is when did we do that topic? So like we're getting ready to do estate planning again. And I thought, oh, we must have just done that last year.
That's
and
right,
I
that's
look
right.
at it, it had been 2.5 years since we had done it. Our memories just aren't reliable for that. And if you want to live in la-la land, I guess that's fine. But if you want to have a highly effective practice, you've got to know those numbers and they've got to be accurate.
I absolutely, forgive me for looking down. I'm just writing down a note. It's something I was like, man, I've got to write this down and do it. I really like that concept of it, right? About what are the real numbers and how do we do it? Another thing, I'm going to start picking on AUM. Well, let's step back here. I think we all agree that's either you should measure things in your practice, right? I've never met an advisor that disagrees with that statement. So we should always measure things. Now the question becomes, what things do we measure? And Jarvis, this is where I think not everything is equal. This isn't where all numbers that you measure in the practice is there. Like measuring how many phone calls may not be effective, right? I'm like, I don't know what that number is really telling me. Maybe somebody measures that and it tells them something good. Sure. So I want to break this down to what are things that every advisor should be tracking. And I want to get down to, I'm going to dare say, the top number that everyone should be tracking, because it's really going to compare things a little bit better. What do you think about that?
I'm curious if we have the same. I'm going to write mine down. So it's obviously AUM.
Mine is the same as Jarvis. No, mine, it's the same. It's the same. All right, so let's talk about that one, right? AUM. All right, so why do we beat up on AUM? Now, there's a couple of questions here, right? One, when you say the AUM number, now one, it's somewhat easy to pull because they're on ADVs. Unless you're under someone else's RIA, then you have no idea. But we like that number because it's reportable, but it's not reported the same. And let me give you a couple of examples of this. And Jarvis, I know you know this. Number one, it's I'll take the Forbes reporting, right? I was talking to advisors that get on the Forbes list because I'm looking at, I'm like, you do not have as much AUM as I do. Like, what the hell is going on? And then how they did the creative accounting in order to come up with those Forbes numbers was it was any asset the client had, regardless of the advisor was managing it or not. And they grossed up this number. So in their mind, they're like, they have this huge number, but in reality, they don't. That's not how much they have at their clearing firm.
Yeah, not to beat up on that one. The other thing, again, we know advisors that have been on this list many times. Maybe this is just sour grapes, Micah, because you and I don't go for these lists.
That's fair enough.
Teams of advisors will alternate years who gets to be on that list. So let's say there's 4 or 5 or 6 advisors in the office. The one advisor that year will get to pool everyone's assets. So maybe they have $100 million each. Suddenly the one guy has $600 million. He goes on the list. Next year, the next guy has $600 million, and the first guy has $0 million, right? So it's shenanigans. The number. So then it translates into, well, what numbers do matter, Micah? Like, so if AUM's a cute number, and you do need to have it accurate, like your ADV, do not screw around with that. Like the SEC has taken action with people that have exaggerated their ADV numbers. So don't screw around with that, right? That needs to be a spot on accurate number, but it's not the end all number.
It's not the end all number, right? And now, again, I don't want to like rag on the Forbes list. If you're using this as a planned marketing strategy, right? Not at advertising, there's a difference. Listen to the other podcasts. But if a planned marketing strategy that says, hey, this is how we're going to gather clients and it works for you, I'm not knocking it. What I'm saying is that's not a measurement. That's not a number I'm going to use to measure the effectiveness of your practice and the growth of your practice.
Yeah, in fact, an example that the other day I was talking to an advisor and he was at $250 million of AUM, self-reported. And so I reached out to him, and I reached out to a lot of advisors. So again, if you think this is you, maybe it is, maybe it's not. I reached out to him. I said, hey, you would be really great for our Invictus program for people that are netting more than $1 million. And he messages back. He says, I'd be really interested. Thank you so much for the information. We just crossed $1 million gross. Oh, no, that's interesting. So you have $250 million of AUM, and you only are grossing $1 million, which, again, amazing milestone, right? Your practice hits $1 million gross. You are really doing good work. But the numbers don't add up, right? Is your AUM fee 40 bips? Like, what's going on here? So it's easy for us to think like, hey, I've hit this trophy number. Everything else is taking care of itself, and that's rarely the case.
Yeah, very much so, right? Okay, so AUM is probably not it. Next one is time in the office. Now, we can also do the opposite, is time out of the office.
I would rather count time out of the office. But yeah, this is for my brother, Stephen Jarvis, head of retirement tax services. right? CPAs really get their rocks off on number of hours billed. In fact, Michael Kitsos was recently on our show, and he said, hey, listen, everybody likes to talk about all the hours they were in their chair. He says, but I guarantee most of those hours were spent playing Office. They were spent checking Facebook or whatever. So maybe you were in the office for 12 hours. Maybe 6 of those were really working.
So it's the same as like an AUM number, right? It doesn't really tell us the story of what's going on. Right? It's a badge. You know, look at all I'm sacrificing, look at the all I'm going to give, but it doesn't really say you're working, right? So, okay, so there's hours in the office, hours out of the office. That's a tough one. That's going to be a number of households. This could be another one as well. So you could come out it and say, you know what, how many households do I have? I have 1,000 households. I have 500 households. I have whatever, right? Whatever that number is. I have 12 households, and you could really have that badge of honor. But that, again, probably isn't a number which really indicates the value that you're providing or the effectiveness of your office.
Critical to track, right? Again, all these are critical to track, but in isolation. It is funny, though, Micah, how we get these badges of honors. Like, well, it depends on what kind of crowds you hang out with. Some of them, right, they'll sit around the table at the conference break and say, like, I have 12 clients and I'm at capacity. 12 clients in that capacity, like for a day? Like, is that your daily capacity? Or to go to other conferences and advisors will be embarrassed that they only have 600 clients, right? So it does span the whole spectrum, but you need to know that number. But that's not the number. So AUM's not the number. Hours in the chair is not the number. Households is not the number.
It's the trade. I think it's really going to come down to trades per day.
Trades per day. Alpha, your investment performance.
All right. Well, it's clearly not that one, right? It's clearly not alpha or investment performance that we're talking about. And so when we're coming up with this one number, trying to build to this nice crescendo, right? This is the one number that I really like because it allows us to quickly level offices and compare advisor to advisor or office to office very quickly. This is going to take all of these things in combine, and it really comes down to, Jarvis, your effectiveness per hour, which we're going to come down to your hourly rate as an advisor, gross or net, right? I think both the numbers are important to look at. So I think calculating both of those, but calculating not your billing rate. That's not what I'm asking. I'm not saying if you're an hourly advisor, what you bill at, or if you're not an hourly advisor, it's zero. It's what is the gross number that you made last year and how much time were you in the office? And let's come up with what that hourly rate of effectiveness is. Now, all of a sudden, we can see something pretty magical that's going to happen. Because let's say, Bob has, $150 million of AUM, but he only bills on 80 million of it. And let's say Sue has, 95 million of AUM and bills on all of it. Okay, well, at first blush, Bob's looks better at 150 million in AUM, but Bob's not charging on most of it, right? That's not the same practice that Sue has when she's charging for all of her advice. And where would we discover this? We would discover this in the effectiveness per hour rate. We would take what's their gross revenue divided by how many hours they worked or how many days they worked, either way you want to go. And that way we're going to come up with a number and say, ooh, all right, now we're somewhere in the ballpark.
Yeah, I would compare this, Micah, to like a safe distribution rate, right? So if we're looking at a retired client, we'll look at, and you referenced this earlier, what are their monthly or annual distributions as a ratio or percentage of their overall investable net worth, right? That gives us our pulse on retirement, if you will, right? So for practices, and again, this number is going to vary dramatically, right? An advisor who's just starting out, who's spending 99% of his or her time prospecting, that's going to be a low number, but we still need to know the number because then we can look at his calendar and say, hey, if your number's $37 an hour, congratulations for getting started in the industry. You need to be spending all day, every day prospecting, right? Whereas an advisor, if they're already at $1,000 or $2,000 an hour, all right, now we need to look at efficiency. We need to look at graduating clients, right? This number really tells us where you're at in your practice.
Really, really important to do that, right? So I take it with the gross, Jarvis. I'd also take it with the net.
I'd do it both, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd have the same thing I do with a client, right? If I'm telling a client we're going to send you $8,000 a month, was that gross or net? Well, when I'm telling a client how much we're going to send them, that's a net number, right? I got to be figuring out the gross number. That's my responsibility. So same thing in this one. What's the gross and then what's the net? And this is a great level playing field because we come out with these numbers and we talk to other advisors. Now, all of a sudden, it's going to factor in the guy that spends 70 hours a week working versus the guy that spends 30 hours a week working, right? And they both have the same revenue. It's not the same practice. And now we're going to see this. It's going to factor in, let's go through this AUM. Why is it superior to AUM? Because it's going to factor in all of the real money that they're charging on. Now, personally, now I still have some client accounts that we're holding some money and we're not charging on, right? Because everybody does. But the question is, how big is that number really getting? That's what this is going to come down to and help us figure that out. Time in the office, this is going to figure that out as well. Where do we sit? Number of households, it's going to figure it in because it really doesn't matter. It matters how much you're in the office and what your effective rate is with the clients. It's not how many households you have. So it's going to take care of that. Trades per day, that was irrelevant anyways, so I don't think that matters. So that's where I'm going to say this is probably the superior number in tracking practices. Thoughts?
No, I completely agree. A couple of things I want to point out here. It shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes tops to calculate this number.
Yeah.
Why? And even that is a bit of a stretch. So the 20 minutes would be pull your P&L, year-to-date revenue, and then pull up your calendar and cross off the days you weren't in the office, right? So just count, and then you can just do some simple math on that. That part could take, the P&L part should take all of about 30 seconds, unless you have to do your 2FA or something like that. The calendar might take you a minute more. Divide the number of days into that, or assume 8 hours a day. The other thing, Mike, I want to point out here is I do not care at all what your projected numbers are. So advisors love to send, we'll ask them like, what do we always ask for? We want to say a list of all your clients, no names, with revenue. We want to see your P&L. We want to see your tax return. We want to see your schedule, right? From there, we can really tell you almost everything that you need to be doing in your practice. Like it's all in there. What advisors love to send is this elaborate spreadsheet projecting what their revenue will be in year 7, and then asking us if we thought that their assumption for the growth of their practice was an accurate assumption. The answer is no, it's not an accurate assumption. Your practice is not going to grow if you're spending your time doing projections. I want to know where your practice is today. If you're a larger firm and you're saying, hey, when are we going to have to hire our 17th employee? Yeah, project that forward so you're ready for that. Everyone else, just do the work, right?
Yeah.
Quit playing office here.
And Jarvis, I would even say this is where an assistant is going to come in. I would not trust your calendar numbers. I would want to see first from your assistant, what are your calendar numbers from your assistant? Is have the team member there. Now, if you don't have a team member in order to help with this is where you need your own executive assistant, your own personal assistant. And that's why we teamed up with Belay. And Belay could come in here and help you out with this one as well, go through the onboarding process. And I would outsource it to that Belay assistant. Say, hey, I want you to go back and tell me the numbers, how much I work. Give them the criteria, what's a work day, what's not a work day, right? Have them look at the calendar and then have it set up. And then you have that number. Why is that more important? Well, same thing on the P&L. You shouldn't be doing your own P&L anyways. So someone else is doing the accounting for it. You're looking at the numbers. Same thing on the calendar.
You know, an interesting one on that, Micah, speaking of having your assistant take care of counting your calendar, right? Which, again, Michael Kitts has talked about that in his episode with us. But I have Zach, my Belay virtual assistant. He goes through forward-looking. And we've dedicated, here are my Jarvis Financial days, here are my TPR days, here are my free days. And those days are all blocked in advance. And one of his jobs is to make sure that anything from another company doesn't end up on that day. So I have a day marked as a free day. No matter who calls, no one gets scheduled on that. If it's marked as a TPR day, only TPR things get scheduled on that. So it passes off that accountability.
That's why Zach never books me on your calendar. You have everything marked as a free day. It's like, sorry, Micah.
They're all marked as no Micah days.
No Micah days. One podcast is enough.
That's enough. All right, so you get this number, right? So you pull your P&L, you pull your calendar, have someone pull it for you, and your number comes out to be whatever it was. We were hosting a virtual mastermind the other day. The numbers that advisors put on range from like $137 an hour to, I think there's somebody was as high as $1,500. Nice. Our personal mastermind runs quite a bit higher than that. But you've got that number, whatever it is. What happens now, Micah? So you know the number.
Now we got to make some decisions, right?
Yeah.
And this is where business planning is really going to come in. Where do we want to be? Now, the nice part is if you're doing this in a mastermind like we have for our Invictus members, we can clearly say kind of the differences and say, hey, all right, Bob, you need to get with George, et cetera, and let's see how we can improve this number. And then we need to look and say, what area are you least effective in? But you have these 4 different quadrants. You have your effectiveness, your value, and start looking at these and saying, how are you being effective with your time? How are you being effective with your value? How are you being effective with your revenue? How are you being effective with your growth, right? And all of a sudden we can break these down and you pick one that you want to work on to improve. Jarvis, I think this is another mistake is everyone takes 37 pages of notes when we do this. And they're like, I'm going to do 6 billion things. It says, that's a great idea, but let's start with just one. What's one thing that's going to make the most impact? It has to be something simple. Not easy. Those are 2 different words.
Yes.
It's something simple that you can control and do it and implement it. Let's get the changes, then move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and of course, that's where we attach extreme accountability to that because as you pointed out, it is typically simple. It is never easy. Otherwise, you would have done it already. Something else, and our next Invictus Mastermind is going to be in February, which I'm really excited for. And you can get signed up for that, right, and be an Invictus member and come join us. But I had started, Micah, tracking my revenue per hour clear back in like 2010 is when I started doing a spreadsheet. I met an advisor who had been doing that, and I started tracking it. But it wasn't until you and I started hanging out and started doing our own extreme accountability circa like 2018, 2019, that I really started taking an honest look at those numbers, right? Because it was one thing for me to look at a spreadsheet and I had excuses for them, like, oh, it's this number because of this. But when I had to write them up there on the whiteboard, on the Post-it note, and you're like, hang on a second, Jarvis, why is this number this? Suddenly it all became very real. Like the level of accountability goes through the roof. And that's why we're so critical, I think, of like these industry surveys, which are all sort of made up number. There's no credit, there's no accountability there. No one's kind of holding your feet to a fire. You sit in a mastermind and you're writing out, here's my gross, here's my net. And somebody says, wait a second, why are you only at a 40% profit margin? Where's the rest of that money going? Oh, it goes to these things. Let's see them. Let's see your P&L. Like, why did you spend this money here? Right. So that accountability is incredible.
It really is. Now, one of the things you got to be careful of when you're writing out these numbers.
Yes.
Is we'll get some advisors up there that are going to put their numbers and they'll start automatically making excuses for why things are. Just stop. Like, seriously, we're all in the same boat.
Yep.
It's just because I hired somebody. Stop. We don't think we can do math. This isn't about your excuses on what you haven't done. This is about you targeting where you need to be. So this isn't a session to beat you down on where it is. That's not it at all. It's all about lifting up. So it's great. What are your goals? And this reason, just like a client, we got to start with our goals first. Then we break into this business planning. Why? Once we have the goals, now we can step back and say, okay, great. You're saying X, but you're doing Y. So which one is it? Do we need to adjust the goal or you need to change your actions? Okay, we need to change your actions. Sweet. Now we bring in that extreme accountability by using this practice analyzer that we can work through one step at a time and say, this is the time to improve your practice.
Another interesting thing that comes up with this, Micah, that I was just reminded of reflecting on some of our masterminds is this revenue per hour, revenue per day lets us know where your practice is relative to needing to hire another person, right?
Such a great
point. We're huge advocates. Hire your first person as quickly as you can. Hire your virtual assistant as quickly as you can. Be very, very slow to hire every additional person. I don't know if it's 9 times out of 10, maybe it's 8 times out of 10. Advisors try to solve a bad process by throwing another person at it. Right. And Micah, you're smiling because we're probably thinking of similar stories.
Yeah, very much so.
Where advisors say, like, what I need is another person. Well, hang on a second. We're looking at your revenue per hour. We're looking at your profitability. Hiring another person is going to destroy both of those numbers. This is a process issue, which, again, when I see an advisor whose revenue per hour number is really high, I think this guy or gal has amazing processes. I need to see their processes and learn from them.
Yes, this is really the key structure right there, right? About putting those two things together. So this is why this is an important number to track of why you have to be able to do it. And you have to be consistent. If somebody else tells you their revenue per hour, you really got to stop and say, how do they come up with the formula? Just like if someone says their AUM, I want to stop and say, how'd you come up with that, right? So let's make sure we're on the same page, but start tracking that today. Then say, great, where was our goal? Where does it want to be? What's your revenue goal for next year? And how much hours do you need to work? Great news. That's simple math, right? And it comes up with what our hourly rate needs to be. Now that's our goal. Fantastic. I want to be able to make $500,000 next year, $1 million next year, whatever it is, and take 6 months off. Sweet. Now we have what these numbers are. Now we can start backing into how much do you need to make per hour to take 6 months off while still grossing $1 million a year.
Micah, I want to do a quick call out for our detractors, which I'm not sure why they still listen, but there's a couple people that will hear this and they'll say, hang on, I don't want to take 6 months off. I want to work all year. Okay. Or there's groups that are saying, hey, listen, I want to deliver value to my clients. I'm not solving for revenue for an hour. So two things. Let's tackle both of those. One is value to clients is table stakes. If you've listened to any episodes of this podcast, you know that we are literally focused on delivering massive value. We have entire books on it. Right. So this is about how are we getting the maximum revenue per hour while still delivering the highest client value.
Yes.
Right. The other one, when people say, well, hey, I don't want to take 6 months off, right? Cool. Then your gross number should be double mine, right? If I'm working 6 months a year and I'm doing 2 million gross, if you're working 12 months a year, then your number should be 4 million gross, at least. Then we get to this reality of like margin of diminishing returns. So it's a lot of times.
This reality of playing office is what we get the reality of. But 100%. Sorry, 100%.
No, you're good. You're good. A lot of times when our numbers aren't good, we make excuses for our own activity, which Micah, you mentioned, or we attack the people whose numbers are better. We say, hey, their numbers are better because they're a bad advisor, because they don't care about clients, because they're greedy, whatever the case may be. Now, you may say like, hey, that person's practice is not one I want to model. And there are practices I do not want to model, but I'm not going to use that as my excuse for my poor performance.
All right, so this is your trigger warning to all of our audience members here.
I see Micah smirking. Like when I can see your expression, like Micah's getting ready. Let me just buckle my seatbelt here. I'm ready.
All fired up.
Bring it on, Micah.
So one of these things that one of the things I'm just getting a little tired of hearing from advisors, because it means when you're going to say it, then I'm going to explain really what it means, right?
Yeah.
Is when an advisor comes in and says, oh, well, I can't do it that way because I add value to my clients. Or, oh, I can't do it that way because I have a better service model than you. Or I can't do it that way because of X, Y, and Z. Like, hold on a second. You're in a room here with 50 to 100 other advisors, and what you're saying is your model is so much better. No one else in this room has ever done it or could ever do it because you add so much value. So we all suck compared to your expertise in financial planning. Why don't you come on stage and walk us through that?
Yeah.
And I'm going to start calling people out on it, because it's one of these lies that we're telling ourselves. Now, I'm not like personally offended. I'm not really worried about it here. What really chaps me, Jarvis, is this is a lie we're telling ourselves that's holding us back. We're holding onto this giant anchor that says, this is so complex. This is so hard to do. And I am the only one that can carry this weight. And it's such bullcrap. I mean, let that damn thing go and actually help your clients. And so let that thing go. And now it's time to take this next step, which is really creating a model which is delivering more and more value. And if you're so egotistical that you think that you are the only one that can really do this, or that you think that you're the only one that has a system in place, then start your own company called the Perfect RIA. Oh, wait, no, that wasn't us. Okay.
I was just thinking that. Yeah.
No, seriously, right, is we're all about learning and striving for perfection. And we got to get past our own ego in order to get there.
You know, and I'm glad you kind of made that joke about the Perfect RIA, right? So it might be easy for someone to listen and say, wait a second, Matt and Micah are telling me to hold loosely like how I do my practice and whatnot. But what you have to understand is, like, so Micah, you and I are very good at what we do. Like, we can pull all these numbers. They're very good numbers. We still hold that all very loosely, right? We spend enormous. I saw actually, Micah, the other day, somebody had posted that in their lifetime they had spent $80,000 in personal development. It was a testimonial for a program. In their lifetime, they had spent $80,000 in personal development. Now, there was a point in my life where that was more than I had spent in my lifetime.
Correct.
I am now at a point in my life where that's less than I spend in a year on personal development, professional development. That is how hungry we are to improve our game. So it'd be easy to kick back and say, hey, we started the Perfect RIA. We have the top podcast for advisors by advisors in the industry, but we're constantly trying to learn it. And I mentioned that because for our listeners, that's how you get here, is you're just so hungry for learning. You're so hungry to say, where is my practice weak? Where can it be stronger? That you're just relentlessly driven to the next level.
And again, the origin story, a lot of behind this was, Jarvis, you and I, we found each other because we wanted like-minded people that were still pushing it, right? Not riding off on a sunset coasting, but still like, great, I've hit this, what I feel is a plateau, or I'm coming up on a plateau, but I know it's not the end. What's next? And we're constantly searching for pushing for that. So I don't care where you are at in this effectiveness per hour scale, right? It's not about the higher dollar amount. It's about the next step that you're at. So where are you at now? What's that real number? And then how do we move it? And on that note, this podcast is all about action items. So Jarvis, let's talk about some action items for our listeners.
Yeah, action item number one, of course, in 2 weeks, so a week and a half from now, we're having our Nation webinar on Wednesday, October 18th.
I love it. One of the things that you should absolutely do if you haven't done it yet, jump on the perfectria.com/quiz, take the quiz. It's a free quiz. What I like about it is it's going to break these things down for you one step at a time. And because the way hopefully we set up to ask the questions, it's going to help you stop lying to yourself.
Yeah, a quick point on that. That the results that you get are not based on industry surveys or any sort of like averages. Like, they're based on real practices that we run and that we coach. So it's a real thing. Give it a try. Right? There's nothing to lose there. And then, of course, go on while you're on the website, schedule yourself for the October 18th webinar. Micah, as always, man, it's a great pleasure. I'm glad we could hop up on the soapbox today for all of our listeners. Look at those numbers. Make them move them in the right direction. And until next time, happy planning.
Happy planning.
Information designed to change lives. Financial planning can make you thrive. Start today, don't think twice.